Professor Alon Cohen is a professor in the School of Electrical Engineering here in Tel Aviv University. And he will tell us about recent advances in learning to control. Control what?
Control systems.
In learning to control systems. Okay, thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you for having me. This talk is just going to be a very sort of high-level overview of work that we've done up until a couple of years ago on learning to control, where sort of control theory meets reinforcement learning, meets online learning, meets statistical learning. You'll see what I mean in a couple of slides. So basically, it's worked with all of these wonderful collaborators, and we've published many papers, and of course, other groups around the world working on it. And essentially, the idea is to take the classical theory of control and use more modern tools and techniques in order to get better results or solve problems that we couldn't solve before with control. So for those of you unfamiliar with control theory is sort of essentially it's very similar to planning in some sense, but mostly the systems are continuous. In many systems, also the time is continuous, and the algorithms or the solutions that are obtained are usually used to sort of solve more sort of hardware kind of problems, like let's say you're running an air conditioner or a fridge, you want the fridge to reach a certain temperature, and you have some sensors inside, and they tell you the actual temperature. So now you need to sort of choose how much power you want to invest in the air conditioner or the fridge in order to reach that certain temperature. But once you get there, you don't need as much, so you might lower the amount of power that you're using, and so on. So in this example, the goal is to sort of minimize, let's say, minimize the amount of power that you're using and reach the desired temperature as best as you can. But of course, there are many examples like robotics, like data center cooling, autonomous vehicles, mechanical ventilation. So actually, mechanical ventilation is an interesting problem because, as it turns out, different people have different body shapes, and the way that their lungs are built is different. So a mechanical ventilator sort of has to adapt itself to the person that it's being used on. So this is an example of a problem called adaptive control, where you have some controller, you have the parameters, but you don't know the parameters that you want to choose in advance. So as the system is going on, you want to sort of converge to the optimal set of controls without knowing them a priori. Another example is it's also a classic problem in control. It's called tracking, where you have some targets, and you want the system to reach the target. So this is, for example, in the case of the fridge or the air conditioning, where you have some desired temperature, and you want to sort of set the amount of power that you're using accordingly. But also, this target might change over time. So let's say that you have this robot, and you want the robot to follow someone around some terrain area. So the robot doesn't know what this person is going to do, but it sort of needs to observe what this person is and try and sort of choose choose what to do next in order to reach this person as quickly as they can. Okay, so these are classic problems in control, and they date back to the 50s and the 60s, but many things changed since then. So all of these classic results are done, in theory, they're done asymptotically. So you have this result where, let's say in adaptive control, the controller will asymptotically, as time goes to infinity, it will converge to the parameters will converge to the optimal parameters. Okay, but now we have finite time guarantees. We have the tools of regret minimization, which Ishai talked about. We have concentration of measure inequalities. So we can use these to sort of try and quantify the amount of time it takes the controller to converge. We can talk about how fast the controller is converging to the optimal set of parameters. Also, these old systems usually were very low dimensional. There was one signal or one input or one sensor that the system used. And now the modern systems are very high dimensional. There's lots of sensors. Robots are very complicated, lots of things to control. Also, we have the tool of online convex optimization, which also Ishai mentioned, online learning, where we are able to adapt to adversarial inputs. We can sort of lift the assumption that everything is drawn from some underlying distribution. Everything is stationary, so what was in the past will be in the future, and things can sort of change over time, and we can adapt to them. So the classic model in control is what's called linear quadratic control, and here we're going to talk about linear quadratic stochastic control. So if you're familiar with MDPs, they're very similar. The idea is that the difference is that here both the action, xt, and the control, ut, the action, are real valued vectors. But we also have a very specific structure for the cost and for the dynamics. So the dynamics are linear in both, the next state is chosen as a linear function of the current state and the current control, plus some random Gaussian noise. And the cost is quadratic in both the current state and the current action. Okay? And when these parameters are known, usually people talk about minimizing the steady state cost, which is sort of the average cost of the system as time goes to infinity. And as it happens, these kind of systems converge to some steady state. So the actual state itself, the distribution of the state converges to some Gaussian distribution, zero mean Gaussian distribution. Okay. But once again, also classic results, they don't tell you anything about the rate of convergence or anything about like the variance of this distribution and so on. So in adaptive control, we know the cost, but we don't know these parameters A and B. Okay? So we want to learn them as we go along. And in our formulation, or this formulation that we borrowed, the regret here is the cost of our learning algorithm. Okay, so it's the overall cost after, let's say, capital T time steps of our learning algorithm, minus the cost of had we played the optimal policy that knows A and B from the start. So this is a slightly different notion of regret from what Ishai talked about. It's what's called policy regret, because we care about what would have happened had we played pi star, the optimal policy, from the start. We don't know which states are going to be visited. We don't know anything about this policy, but we still, on average, want to converge to what this policy would have done. And in 2019, we published a paper along, there was another paper that reached the same result, that gave a polynomial time algorithm that enjoys a root T regret, where T is the number of steps of the algorithm. A year later, we also published a lower bound showing that basically our result is optimal. One of the main challenges here was the idea that we don't know anything about the rate of convergence to the steady state. So let's say that we choose some policy, we know it's going to converge to the steady state, we don't know how long. So we had to define generalize the standard notion of stability of these systems to what we call strong stability that allowed us to sort of quantify the rate and the time it takes to converge to the steady state. So once you place such a strongly stable policy, you're going to converge to the steady state very quickly, and you're also sort of going to forget what the policy, doesn't matter where you were when you started using it, is going to forget the point in which, it's going to help you sort of forget where you were before. So changing a policy each time didn't have sort of, it had sort of like a reasonable price to pay. And this is something that wasn't available before. The next problem that I'm going to talk about is what's called adversarial control, or and this is basically a generalization of the tracking problem, in which we know the matrices A and B, but we don't know the cost. And also the cost changes adversarially over time. So each time we see the current state, we choose the control or the action, and only after that the cost is revealed to us. And we were working on this paper that we were assuming Gaussian noise and quadratic cost, like in the standard model. But then people saw that actually you can do this with general convex cost functions, quadratic or not, and where the noise itself is adversarial. So even still, you don't have to assume IID noise. So this is very important. Let's say in the case you want to fly a drone, and you have some drift from the wind, and the wind changes over time, and so you still want to be able to adapt to situations where the wind may be strong and may be weak, and so on. Finally, we combined both of these things, and we were able to do what's called online convex optimization in adaptive control. Well, the cost changes over time, but also the dynamics are unknown a priori. There were a few works that did sort of limited solutions up until then. And then in 2020, we published these two papers that basically solved this problem, got us a root T regret polynomial time algorithm. And that's that. So to finalize, there are many extensions to this model. So you can talk about partial observation, where you only see like a noisy linear function of the state, and you never see the actual state. There are results where we have bandit feedback, so you only see the cost, the value of the cost in the current state and action, and not the entire cost function. There's also results where we have where the goal is to get competitive ratio. So you compete with the optimal sequence of policies instead of a fixed policy. In a more high level, these results sort of bridge some kind of gap between control and reinforcement learning and online learning. And there are also some works that view this kind of online control as a new type of regulator, different than classic H2 and H infinity control. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Cohen. Are there any questions? Please.
Can you say something about the algorithm?
So the question was, can we say anything about the algorithm itself? So as it turns out, in the case, so for the problem of adaptive control, the solution in the end was quite surprising, because this is a case where the optimal thing to do is what's called explore then commit, where you first gather information about the system and then you commit to it. And usually this is not optimal, but here for some reason it is. For the case of online control, you basically sort of you do this kind of very complicated reduction to online convex optimization, online learning, you solve this, and the goal here is to also choose strongly adaptive policies that change slowly over time. And so you sort of track the steady state of the policy as you go along because you never drift too far from it. That's the gist of it. Hope this answers your question.
Any other questions?
That's okay. The question was whether the LQG problem is related to error correcting codes. So the short answer is no, just because everything, like the observations are continuous. So basically you sort of combine this sort of control algorithms that I talked about with this kind of auto-regression that lets you estimate the current state as you go along, roughly speaking. Something like that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.